Some dinners once appeared on the tables of millions of American families. Yet, if they were served today, many people would probably find it hard to believe that they had once fed an entire generation. With only $5 in their pockets, a box of macaroni and cheese costing 19 cents, a can of soup costing 25 cents, and 1 pound of ground beef that had to feed 6 people. They transformed ordinary ingredients into 25 dishes that are still remembered today. What is most surprising is that the farther you go down the list, the stranger, humbler, and more revealing these dishes become, showing that what kept a family together was never just the food itself. Let us open the door once again to an American kitchen in 1973. Where every dinner was a problem to solve, and every recipe was another way to help the family make it through one more day. Opening the door to an American kitchen in 1973, $5 had to cover an entire day of meals. On a late autumn afternoon in 1973, inside a small supermarket in suburban Ohio, the pale glow of fluorescent lights washed over the ground beef trays, already more than half empty. A mother stood for a long time in front of the meat counter, her hand tightly gripping a soft leather wallet, worn smooth at the corners after years of use. She picked up a package of ground beef, looked at the price label, let out a quiet sigh, and carefully placed it back exactly where it had been. Just a few weeks earlier, that same package had easily fit within the family's budget. Today, every calculation had to begin all over again. In her shopping cart were only 1 box of Kraft Mac and Cheese, priced at about 19 cents, 1 can of Campbell's soup for about 25 cents, 1 loaf of white bread costing nearly 35 cents, 1 bag of dried beans for less than 60 cents, and 1 bottle of ketchup that she already knew would have to be used 1 drop at a time. Every time the cash register clicked, the room seemed to fall a little quieter. The $5 in her wallet still had to cover tonight's dinner, her husband's lunch for tomorrow, lunches for the children, even a little extra food in case prices climbed again before the weekend. In countless American kitchens at that time, dinner began not with a new cookbook, but with an old recipe box. Weathered recipe cards still carried dried stains of cream of mushroom soup, the edges faintly scented with margarine, and hurried notes written years before. One card read, "Meatloaf, add oats if there isn't enough meat." Another reminded, "Tuna noodles, save the potato chips for the topping." A third simply said, "Jell-O for the kids this weekend." Every recipe served as a quiet reminder that with just a little creativity, the whole family could still gather around the old wooden table with a steaming casserole fresh from the oven. That decade became famous for disco, bell-bottom pants, and the new color televisions appearing in living rooms. But behind the kitchen door were dinners costing less than $3. It's where 1 pound of ground beef had to feed 6 people, and 1 can of tuna could become an entire meal. If you love food stories told through the memories of a bygone era, be sure to follow from the very beginning, because behind the kitchen door of 1973, there are still countless humble family dinners waiting to be rediscovered. The boxes that kept hunger away, packaged foods became dinner. As the kitchen clock struck 6 o'clock in the evening, the pantry door swung open once again. There was not much fresh food left inside, but a few cardboard boxes and several tin cans still sat neatly arranged, like a promise that dinner would begin on time. The mother reached for the familiar box of Kraft Mac and Cheese, the 25th dish in the family's recipe box. The thin aluminum pot quickly came to a rolling boil, and steam fogged the small window above the sink. The pale yellow elbow macaroni tumbled into the water. The packet of bright orange cheese powder was carefully set beside the pot. Around 1974, 1 box of macaroni and cheese cost about 19 cents. If there was a hot dog left in the refrigerator, priced at about 35 cents, or half a can of tuna left over from the previous meal, everything would be chopped into small pieces and mixed. The entire pot often cost less than 70 cents, but the youngest child still beamed with delight at the sight of the cheese sauce coating every piece of steaming hot macaroni. The 24th dish always appeared on chilly days. 2 slices of white bread embraced a slice of soft American cheese. A thin layer of margarine was spread across the outside, and the sandwich was pressed onto a hot cast-iron skillet. The aroma of melting butter gradually filled the kitchen, while a can of Campbell's tomato soup was stirred together with water on the stove. Between 1973 and 1975, a can of soup usually cost about 25 cents, while the bread, cheese, and margarine added another 20 cents or so. For less than 50 cents, it became a dinner that warmed the children's hands after school as they dipped each crisp bite of grilled cheese into the bright red bowl of soup. The 23rd dish brought with it the distinctive pale green color of Watergate salad. A glass serving bowl sat in the center of the table, filled with pistachio pudding mixed with canned pineapple, signature marshmallows, chopped nuts, and whipped topping. Around 1976, the entire bowl cost between $1.25 and $1.75, enough for many people to share during a weekend gathering. It did not keep anyone full for very long, but it brightened the old wooden table with its cheerful color. For many American families during that decade, cardboard boxes and tin cans always brought a sense of reassurance. A can of soup still sitting on the shelf, this meant there was still a way to make things work. A box of macaroni and cheese in the cupboard meant dinner would never be skipped. That is why the sound of a can opening every afternoon blended so naturally with the aroma of toasted bread and the steam rising from a pot of soup, becoming one of the familiar sounds of kitchens that knew how to preserve warmth during the years when every single cent had to be carefully counted. Its pound of ground beef had to feed 6 people. The aroma of sautéed onions mingling with ground beef the moment it touched the bottom of the pot always brought the children running into the kitchen earlier than usual. They imagined there would be plenty of meat for dinner, but their mother knew that the wooden spoon stirring the pot was mixing a meal built more on careful planning than abundance. The 22nd dish was chili served with cornbread, a familiar meal in countless American households around 1975. 1 pound of ground beef, costing about $1 to $1.20, is browned with onions before making room for kidney beans, canned tomatoes, chili powder, and extra water to stretch the pot a little farther. 1 box of Jiffy corn muffin mix, priced at about 19 cents, quickly became a batch of fragrant golden cornbread served beside the gently bubbling chili. The entire meal cost only about $2.50 to $3, enough to feed 6 people with a small container left over for the next day. The beans made each bowl feel heartier. The cornbread held its warmth longer. The gentle heat of the chili peppers made everyone feel as though they had enjoyed a truly generous dinner. The 21st dish was a meatloaf topped with a glossy layer of ketchup, fresh from the oven. Shiny red topping glowed beneath the warm kitchen light, while the aromas of roasted meat, onions, and sweet tomatoes spread throughout the room. 1 pound of ground beef, costing about $1, was mixed with breadcrumbs, oats, eggs, and chopped onions to create a meatloaf large enough for 6 even slices. The total cost came to only about $1.75 to $2.25. My mother always sliced it very slowly, carefully making each piece the same thickness, as though every cut of the knife carried a quiet promise of fairness for every plate. The 20th dish was porcupine meatballs. As the meatballs simmered in tomato sauce, tiny white grains of rice gradually emerged like little quills. 1 pound of ground beef, half a cup of rice, and a can of tomato sauce costing about 25 to 35 cents created an entire pot of food for the family at a total cost of about $2. The children laughed at the playful name, while the adults understood that every grain of rice helped the meat go just a little farther. The 19th dish transformed an ordinary hamburger bun into a little boat. The soft bread center was mixed with ground beef, onions, tomato soup, and slices of American cheese before being stuffed back into the bun and baked until golden. Around 1975, the entire tray cost only about $2.50 to $3. The crisp golden boats were placed on the table. The children eagerly chose their own, while their mother smiled quietly, knowing that everyone would enjoy a dinner that felt far more generous than the amount of money that remained in her wallet. Casseroles of the days before payday. There was always a certain time each month when many American kitchens grew quieter than usual. The envelope holding the family's paycheck had become noticeably thinner, while the next payday was still days away. It was on those afternoons that the large cooking pots began appearing on the stove, because everyone knew that a casserole could somehow turn a few simple ingredients into enough food for many meals. The 18th dish was tuna noodle casserole. Between 1974 and 1976, one can of tuna costing about 45 to 55 cents was used very carefully. The tuna was flaked into small pieces and mixed with egg noodles. 1 can of Campbell's cream of mushroom soup costing about 30 cents, a handful of frozen peas, and a topping of crushed potato chips. The entire casserole cost only about $1.50 to $2, enough to feed 4 people. When the lightly browned top came out of the oven, the aroma of canned tuna blended with the creamy sauce and filled the room, carrying with it the comforting feeling that dinner had been saved for another day. The 17th dish was hobo stew, a meal that changed depending on whatever remained in the pantry. A few potatoes costing about 40 cents, some carrots, onions, a can of corn, canned green beans, and half a pound of ground beef costing about 60 cents were gradually added to a deep pot. Around 1975, the entire stew cost only about $1.75 to $2.25. Steam carrying the sweet aroma of vegetables rose slowly. The lid gently rattled with every simmer. Even those who came home late still found a hot bowl waiting for them. The 16th dish was ground beef stew, and half a pound of ground beef was browned until the edges were lightly caramelized before being combined with potatoes, carrots, celery, and a can of tomato soup. The total cost came to about $1.75 to $2.25, enough to feed 4 or 5 people. Mother always stirred the pot thoroughly before serving, so that every bowl contained a few small pieces of meat nestled among the tender vegetables. The 15th dish was poor man's beef stroganoff. Around 1976, 1 pound of ground beef, costing about $1.20, was cooked with egg noodles, cream of mushroom soup, and a spoonful of sour cream, creating a dinner that cost about $2.75 to $3.50. The creamy sauce coating, the golden noodles, somehow made the old Formica kitchen table feel a little more elegant. Sometimes the thing that brought comfort to a family after a long day began with nothing more than a steaming pot of casserole and a beautiful name for a very humble meal. When dried beans, ham bones, bacon, scraps became valuable treasures. There were kitchens where the most valuable things were tucked away in the small compartment at the bottom of the refrigerator, where a ham bone was carefully wrapped in wax paper and a few scraps of bacon were saved from previous meals. Someone from outside might glance past them without a second thought, but for many American families, in the middle of the 1970s, there were the reserves set aside for the days when the wallet was nearly empty. The 14th dish began with a bag of dried white beans, costing about 40 to 60 cents. After soaking overnight, plump beans were placed into a pot with onions, carrots, and a few pieces of bacon, costing about 30 to 40 cents. Around 1974 to 1975, an entire pot of white bean soup, cost only about $1 to $1.25. The gentle smoky aroma from the bacon slowly soaked into every tender bean, while the thick soup clung to the spoon, filling the kitchen with warmth throughout the afternoon. The 13th dish was ham and bean soup. After Sunday dinner, the ham bone with a little meat still attached was always carefully saved. At the beginning of the week, it was dropped into a pot with dried beans, onions, and carrots. The broth gradually turned a golden brown, while the smoky aroma spread slowly but lingered for hours. If the ham bone had already been saved from the previous meal, the entire pot required only about 70 cents to $1 more for the beans and vegetables, but it was enough to provide Monday night's dinner and even lunch the following day. The 12th dish was lentil soup. Around 1975, a bag of dried lentils costing about 45 to 65 cents was cooked with onions, carrots, celery, and a little salt. Add a few slices of stale bread toasted until crisp. The entire pot cost about $1 to $1.25, enough to feed 4 to 6 people. The rising steam carried the gentle sweetness of cooked vegetables, while every thick spoonful brought comfort to tired stomachs after a long day's work. Looking back at these meals, what remains most memorable is not their cost, but the way every ingredient was carefully preserved. Bacon fat was collected in a small container for the next meal, stale bread was toasted instead of thrown away, and the ham bone lived on in another pot of soup. In those kitchens, abundance was built through thrift, patient hands, and the belief that as long as there were still a few beans left in the jar, the family's dinner table would always have a warm meal to gather around. The dishes that were not pretty saved dinner. There were dinners that, if placed on the table today, would probably make many people quietly push their plates aside. Yet during the middle of the 1970s, those humble meals helped millions of families end a long day with full stomachs. The 11th dish was chipped beef gravy, served over white bread. Around 1974, half a pound of ground beef costing about 60 cents was browned until fragrant, then mixed with flour and milk to create a smooth, creamy gravy. 2 slices of white bread waited on the plate to catch each steaming ladleful. The entire meal cost only about $1 to $1.25 if the family already had flour and milk on hand. The father returned home after his work shift, his shoes still dusty from the road, quietly eating each bite as though he wanted the warmth of the meal to last a little longer. The 10th dish was beef liver with onions. The liver was sliced thin, lightly coated with flour, placed into a hot skillet with golden slices of onion. Around 1975, beef liver cost about 30 to 50 cents per pound, making it far less expensive than the more desirable cuts of meat. Dinner for a family of 4 cost only about $1 to $1.50. The sweet aroma of onions filled the kitchen. The distinctive flavor of the liver was still strong enough for the children to recognize with the very first bite. They ate slowly while the adults smiled, knowing that the meal provided valuable nutrition without straining the family budget. The 9th dish was a ham salad sandwich. Leftover ham was finely chopped and mixed with mayonnaise, sweet pickle relish, and a little mustard. Between 1974 and 1976, if the ham was left over from an earlier meal, an entire batch of sandwiches cost only about 50 to 75 cents. Sandwiches were carefully packed into metal lunchboxes so they could travel with the children to school the next morning. The 8th dish was even simpler, the peanut butter and jelly sandwich. 1 jar of peanut butter and 1 jar of grape jelly could make dozens of sandwiches, with each serving costing only about 10 to 15 cents around 1975. There were evenings when the kitchen was almost silent as a knife gently spread peanut butter across the bread before adding a layer of jelly. The whole family sat down together with a few glasses of water or the little milk that remained. Those simple sandwiches carried families through countless seasons of inflation, quietly preserving the warmth around the dinner table when there was very little else left in the refrigerator to choose from. The fancy dishes on the family dinner table, sometimes the greatest luxury in an American kitchen during the middle of the 1970s, was simply the feeling that dinner looked more special than usual. Families still bought the same familiar ingredients and still counted every penny at the checkout counter. But when the meal was placed on the table, everyone hoped it would make the room feel just a little brighter. The seventh dish was stuffed bell peppers. 6 green bell peppers were neatly arranged in a baking dish, each filled with a mixture of ground beef, rice, onions, and tomato sauce. Around 1975, 1 pound of ground beef cost about $1 to $1.20. 6 bell peppers cost about 60 to 90 cents. And with tomato sauce and seasonings included, the entire tray cost about $2.75 to $3.25. Once the glossy red sauce coated the tender baked peppers, a simple family dinner table suddenly took on the appearance of a carefully prepared special meal. The sixth dish was baked spaghetti with tomato sauce. The spaghetti was mixed with canned tomato sauce and cottage cheese and topped with a thin layer of mozzarella before being baked in the oven. The edges of the casserole bubbled gently, while strands of pale golden cheese stretched with every serving. Around 1976, the entire casserole cost about $3 to $3.50, enough to feed 6 people when served with bread or salad. The aroma of tomatoes blended with melted cheese, leaving the children lingering near the kitchen doorway while they waited for dinner. The fifth dish was meatballs in pineapple sauce, a dish that often appeared at family gatherings. Ground beef was mixed with breadcrumbs and shaped into many smaller meatballs before being coated in a sauce from canned pineapple, ketchup, and brown sugar. Around 1977, the entire tray cost about $3 to $4. Wooden toothpicks inserted into each meatball gave the dish the cheerful feeling of a weekend party. The fourth dish was cheese fondue. A small pot sat in the center of the table, filled with melted cheese and surrounded by cubes of day-old bread. Between 1975 and 1977, a homemade fondue dinner cost about $4 to $6 and was usually reserved for birthdays or weekend evenings. Laughter blended with the soft music coming from the radio in the living room as pieces of bread were dipped into the hot cheese and passed from one person to another. Outside the window, prices continued to climb week after week, yet inside that little kitchen, the whole family still found a memorable evening through humble dishes prepared with resourcefulness, care, and love. The dessert had to be thrifty too. Sweetness always came last in the working-class kitchens of America during the 1970s. After the soup pot had been emptied, the meat tray had grown lighter, and the dinner plates had been gathered beside the sink. The mother still found a way to let the children end the meal with something that would make them smile. The third dish was wacky cake, a famous cake made without its most expensive ingredients. Flour, sugar, and cocoa powder were poured directly into the baking pan. 3 small wells were made to hold vegetable oil, vinegar, and vanilla before water was added and everything was stirred together. Around 1974, when the prices of eggs and milk kept rising, the entire cake cost less than $1 and could be cut into 8 slices. The aroma of cocoa filled the old kitchen, and no one seemed to mind that the cake contained neither eggs nor butter. The second dish was mock apple pie, an apple pie that contained no apples at all. Ritz crackers were soaked in a syrup made with lemon juice and cinnamon before being poured into a pie crust and baked in the oven. Around 1975, the entire pie cost about $1.25 to $1.75, making it considerably less expensive than using fresh apples. As the gentle fragrance of cinnamon spread throughout the house, the children still believed they were about to enjoy a real apple pie. Their mother smiled as she looked at the beautifully golden pie, because what she truly wanted to preserve was the feeling of the family gathered around their familiar dinner table. The first dish was Jell-O 123, a package costing about 35 to 45 cents around 1976, was beaten with hot water before being poured into small glass cups. After a few hours in the refrigerator, the dessert naturally separated into 3 delicate layers. The children pressed their faces against the refrigerator door to watch each layer slowly set, while the adults were pleased that such an attractive dessert could also be so economical. Sometimes, on weekend evenings in 1977, the kitchen became even brighter with crepe Suzette. Crepes were drizzled with a sauce made from orange juice, butter, and sugar, and occasionally a splash of liqueur was added so that blue flames would leap into the air for a few brief seconds. The entire dessert cost about $4 to $5 and was reserved for those rare special occasions. The flickering flames reflected from the old dinner plates as laughter echoed around the table, leaving everyone with the comforting feeling that even during the years when every penny mattered, their family still had every reason to share a little sweetness before night fell. The unusual dishes that only the 1970s would have dared to put on the table. By the end of the 1970s, the American kitchens had begun experimenting with unusual recipes clipped from homemaking magazines and carefully tucked into the family's recipe box. The people were searching for was not necessarily the most delicious dish, but something different that would make a weekend meal feel just a little more special. The fourth dish was tomato aspic with canned vegetables. The tomato juice was heated and blended with gelatin before canned vegetables were stirred in and the mixture was poured into a mold. Around 1975, the entire dish cost about $1.25. The mold was inverted onto a serving plate. The crystal-clear red gelatin sat among crisp green lettuce leaves, becoming the centerpiece that every host proudly served to guests at lunch. To them, it was a modern dish that reflected both style and thoughtful hospitality. The third dish was ham rolls with cream cheese. Thin slices of ham were spread with cream cheese, rolled tightly, coated with chopped nuts or crushed potato chips, and sliced into bite-sized rounds. Around 1976, an entire appetizer tray like this cost about $2 to $3, set on a table covered with a floral tablecloth, beside glasses of orange-colored punch and a handful of wooden toothpicks. The dish helped make Saturday evening gatherings feel cheerful, even though most of the conversations still revolved around the rising prices of gasoline, groceries, and housing. The second dish was bananas wrapped in ham and topped with hollandaise sauce. Ripe bananas were wrapped in slices of ham, covered with a glossy golden hollandaise sauce, and baked in the oven. Between 1975 and 1977, the entire tray cost about $2.50 to $3.50. The sweetness of the bananas blended with the savory flavor of the ham to create a surprisingly unusual combination. At the time, many families considered it fashionable and wonderfully creative. The first dish was fried green tomatoes. Firm green tomatoes were sliced, coated in cornmeal, and lowered into hot oil. Between 1974 and 1976, if the tomatoes came from the backyard garden, the entire platter cost only about 25 to 40 cents for the cornmeal, cooking oil, and seasonings. A cheerful sizzle filled the summer kitchen as the crisp golden coating surrounded the gently tart tomatoes inside. It was a dish that reminded people that anything still useful was worth saving, because during the years when every penny had to be carefully considered, resourcefulness was often more valuable than even the most expensive ingredients. These were not just 25 dishes, they were how a generation kept dinner on the table night had fully settled over the little kitchen in suburban America. Only a thin layer of red sauce remained at the bottom of the chili pot. The tuna noodle casserole dish was more than half empty, with a few crushed potato chips still clinging to the edges, while the bowl of Jell-O had been carefully covered with plastic wrap and returned to the refrigerator to be saved for tomorrow. On the Formica countertop, a spoon still marked with a streak of dried soup rested beside a supermarket receipt folded in half, where prices of 19 cents, 25 cents, and $1.20 told the story of a day spent calculating every purchase with care. A few plates soaked in the sink, and a vinyl-covered chair sat slightly pulled away from the table, evidence that the children had just run into the living room, where the television continued casting its pale blue glow as the laughter from an evening program filled the house. Mother stood quietly for a few more seconds before turning off the stove, looking at the leftovers, and silently wondering how she could transform them into another meal the following morning. During the years of inflation that followed the oil crisis of 1973, these dishes accompanied countless American families. A box of Kraft Mac and Cheese costing 19 cents, a can of Campbell soup for about 25 cents, 1 pound of ground beef stretched with rice, oats, or breadcrumbs, and a wacky cake made from the simplest ingredients, all reflected the patience of people who were determined to keep a hot dinner on the table. The sound of a spoon tapping against a bowl, the oven door closing, the pop of a can being opened, became the familiar soundtrack of an era when every single dollar had to go as far as possible. Today, many people might smile when they see tomato aspic, bananas wrapped in ham, or an apple pie that contained no apples at all. But for the mothers of 1974, those dishes were expressions of love made from whatever they had on hand. Those memories still live on in the aroma of cocoa drifting from a freshly baked cake, in the carefully even slices of meatloaf, in the small cup of Jell-O placed in front of every child, in the old skillet that was faithfully washed clean after every family meal. If your family also has had a simple dish that you still remember today, share it in the comments below. If you enjoy stories about old kitchens, where every meal carries the memories of resourcefulness and love, be sure to follow the channel, because sometimes history is preserved most clearly in the lingering aroma of food after dinner has come to an end. Perhaps these dishes would never appear on the menu of an elegant restaurant. For many people who grew up in those kitchens, the aroma of a pot of chili, a pan of tuna casserole, or a humble cocoa-scented cake is still enough to take them back to childhood in just a few seconds. If your family also had a simple dish that you have remembered your entire life, share its story in the comments below. And if you would like to open many more old recipe boxes that time has nearly forgotten, be sure to follow the channel, because there are still many old kitchens waiting for us to step inside.